The confusion with budget Motorola phones continues. So I like to think I've reviewed quite a few budget Motorola devices, include the G30, G31 and G32. And in some way or another there's differences across all of those models, and still with this G34, well, no G33 apparently. So for the display, the G34 has a 6.5 inch 720p 120Hz IPS LCD display. Now what makes this odd is it's actually a downgrade from the 1080p found on the G32, but an upgrade from the 90Hz on that phone. Why? I mean, 720p on a new budget phone going into 2024 at the time, I don't really see why that's still a thing, but why the downgrade in resolution? But to be fair to Motorola, the display is nice and vibrant, gets bright enough outdoors, and the responsiveness is absolutely fine. You still get a thicker chin along the bottom, but that never really went away. But Motorola used a 60Hz AMOLED display on the G31 before that, so a nice punchier display, but why the drop in refresh rate? Especially since the G30 before that had a 90Hz. What? But you do get the same punch hole design as last year's model with the same 16 megapixel resolution camera. And these photos are pretty decent for a budget phone with nice amounts of detail. Colour reproduction is a bit more vibrant in standard mode, whereas portrait mode offers more natural looking colours, and subject separation is good enough. But the rest of the design is typical for other budget phones at this price. It's an all plastic build with the usual button and port placements, and you do get a set of Dolby Atmos stereoed speakers, which is nice at this price. And the back is a matte plastic finish which hide fingerprints well, and a more glossy finish with the dual camera island. And there's also a side mounted fingerprint scanner which is fast and responsive. I've got the phone in ice blue, but it's also available in emerald green and charcoal black, and the phone is pretty lightweight as well at just 180 grams. So what about performance? Well, this is an area where the G34 actually has some nice improvements over those other models. It sports the Snapdragon 695, which has a nice boost in performance and of course 5G connectivity, but unfortunately that is still an aging chip released over 2 years ago. But the performance in my use has been flawless. I've had no stutters in my everyday use, and while the 4 gigs of RAM is a little bit low, this hasn't hindered my experience. And there are options with 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigs of storage, so if you're into heavy multitasking, I suggest going for one of those models. But one area where the G34 does excel, and it is the case for most of these budget Motorolas, and that is the battery life. You get a large 5000 mAh cell, which was enough to get me through a full day of pretty moderate use, and a light user could definitely get through 2 days from this phone. And the confusion continues as the mediocre 18 watt charging on the G34 is a considerable downgrade from the 30 watts charging from that G32. Why? Your guess is as good as mine. But on the plus side, for software you get a new Android 14 on the G34 with a pretty stock Android experience, but a bit out of character for Motorola on this phone is there are quite a few preloaded apps, mainly games such as Candy Crush, Block Blast and Solitaire, and you also get Booking.com, something I'm not used to seeing on a Motorola. But of course these can be deleted if you want to get rid of them, which I certainly will be doing. But the usual software experience is the usual, plenty of customization options in the settings for themes and wallpapers, and you get to jump into Motorola's own app for shortcuts to these settings, but also access to Motorola security features and tips guide. And this is the first that I've used a Motorola phone in quite a few months, and I do really enjoy going back to using them. So hopefully I've covered it all. It's now time for the cameras. The downgrades keep coming. You get a dual camera setup as opposed to a triple or quad setup on the previous models. And this is headlined by the same 50 megapixel main camera from those models. And while those models all come with an 8 megapixel ultra wide, the second lens on here is just a 2 megapixel macro camera. And whilst I'm not the biggest user of ultra-wide cameras, I actually do prefer a telephoto camera. Come to think of it, Motorola has actually removed the ultra-wide from quite a few of their most recent models, but it's an odd move either way. Photos from the main 50 megapixel camera come out as good as you would expect at this price. Colours are mostly natural, although a couple of photos came out a bit more saturated than some may like. Detail is good enough, although the phone may struggle with some finer areas. And moving into even slightly lower light situations brings out softer images. And portrait mode offers some nice photos with colour pretty consistent across both modes. And video tops out at 1080p at 30 FPS from both the front and the rear cameras. And here's a few photo and video samples. Let me know what you think from this G34. So that's my look at the relatively new Motorola G34. Now, at its usual selling price of 150 quid off Amazon, there are definitely better options out there. For example, the new Samsung Galaxy A15 4G is available on Amazon for just 96 quid, or at least that's what I paid for it, and it's still hovering around the £100 mark. Now, while the ultra-wide is pretty pup, the flexibility is still there. And it also has a 90Hz 1080p panel as opposed to the 720p on the G34. But I picked this up off eBay in basically new condition with the box and unused accessories for just 80 quid, and at that price it's pretty darn good. But check out my video of the Galaxy A15 here, and I'll see you there.